The summer sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over the wagon trail that snaked through the plains of the Wyoming Territory. Dust kicked up with every creaking wheel and stomping hoof, hanging in the air like the past Clara Whitmore was desperate to escape. At just 27, Clara had seen more pain than most women twice her age. She had grown up in a respectable family in Missouri, but her father's debts and misplaced trust in wealthy friends led her into a marriage not of love, but of survival. Her husband, Burke Lantry, was a man of influence and brutality. Behind the polished veneer of wealth lay a cruel temper and controlling hand. When Clara bore him no sons, only a daughter, his affection turned cold and violent. By the time Ellie was 6, Clara had made up her mind she would not let her daughter grow up in fear. Through whispered conversations with a neighbor and a bribe to a reluctant wagon master, Clara managed to buy 2 places on a westbound wagon train heading toward Oregon. She carried little more than a satchel of clothes, a locket with her mother's picture, and a secret stash of coin she had hidden away over 2 years. The journey was meant to be their new beginning. For the first few weeks, it almost felt possible. Ellie would giggle as she picked wildflowers along the trail. The child had never known freedom like this. Wide open skies and prairie winds that didn't smell of cigar smoke or broken promises. But peace on the trail was fleeting. There were whispers, strange looks. Some of the men, especially a lean, sharp-eyed trader named Pritchard, began to ask too many questions. Where was Clara's husband? Why was she so quiet about her past? Why did she flinch when a man raised his voice? Clara knew something was wrong when one of the oxen pulling their wagon turned up dead, its water tainted with poison. Then came the accusations. Pritchard claimed Clara had stolen from the camp's supply stash. Another woman insisted she'd seen Clara reading strange symbols, a rumor fueled by the Book of Psalms Clara carried, which bore worn marginalia written in Latin by her mother. The final blow came in the night. They woke her and Ellie before dawn, torches flickering like angry ghosts. The wagon master, pressured by frightened settlers and Pritchard's lies, told her she was no longer welcome. He offered her a single water canteen, a torn blanket, and pointed toward the east. Clara tried to reason. She begged. She pleaded for the sake of her daughter. But fear made people cruel, and ignorance gave them permission. "Take your child and go," the wagon master said, his face hard as flint. "You brought trouble into this camp." And so they went. Clara wrapped Ellie in the blanket and carried her for miles until her arms trembled. The trail stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of dust and despair. The sun beat down, turning sweat into salt and hope into something thin and brittle. Ellie asked for water. Clara gave her the last sip. She tore strips from her dress to shield the child's face from the sun. They passed the hollowed carcass of a buffalo, bones bleached by time. Vultures circled overhead. By the second night, Clara could barely stand. Ellie, her eyes sunken and cheeks flushed, no longer had the strength to cry. Clara made a fire from dry sagebrush and held her daughter close, whispering lullabies from a time before pain. As stars wheeled overhead and coyotes cried in the dark, Clara pressed her forehead to Ellie's and murmured, "I'm so sorry, baby." Mama tried. She didn't know if they'd survive the night. She didn't know if she'd made the right choice fleeing one danger only to find herself at the mercy of the wild. But in that moment, Clara vowed one thing with every ounce of strength she had left. "If we live to see the sunrise, I will never stop fighting for you." What Clara couldn't. Know what no one on the trail could have guessed was that fate was already shifting in the dark, and somewhere not far from where she wept beside dying embers, a lone rider's boots hit the earth and a horse's hooves began to move west. The prairie is a beautiful lie. From a distance, it looks endless and open like freedom. But when you're on foot, with a sick child in your arms and no direction but away, it becomes something else entirely. A place that swallows the weak. A place where even the sun feels cruel. Clara Whitmore hadn't slept in over a day. Her boots were cracked, her feet blistered and bleeding. She no longer walked so much as staggered. One arm cradled Ellie, her sweet, feverish girl, while the other gripped a dead canteen. She had shaken the thing hours ago, hoping maybe a drop clung to the bottom. Nothing. Ellie's skin was hot. Her breathing came in shallow puffs, her lips dry and cracked. She hadn't spoken in hours. They had no map, no food, and no hope of catching up with the wagon train. Clara wasn't even sure what direction they were headed anymore. East? West? She only knew she had to keep moving. Because if she stopped, if she gave in, then it was over. The wind picked up around midday, dry and sharp like a blade. A dust storm began to gather on the horizon, thick and fast. Clara spotted it too late. She pulled the blanket tighter around Ellie and dropped to her knees behind a boulder, shielding the child as best she could. Dust screamed across the land, stinging her eyes, choking her lungs. She buried her face in Ellie's hair and prayed not to a God who had abandoned her, but to the one who might still hear the voice of a mother trying to save her child. When the storm passed, it left behind silence, and despair. Clara couldn't get up. Her legs refused. Her arms shook too hard to hold Ellie any longer. She laid the child down and sat beside her, arms wrapped tight, rocking slowly in the growing dark. That night, something broke. Not in the land. Not in Ellie. In Clara. She stared at the sky, where stars had begun to emerge, cold and uncaring. She thought about her wedding day, the heavy ring, the forced smile, the neighbors whispering about how lucky she was to marry into money. She thought about the nights she spent pretending the bruises were from clumsiness, about the long silences, the locked doors, the way Burke had looked at Ellie like she was just another tool to control. Clara with Dot, she thought about how she'd run from all that evil, only to be cast out by strangers who were too scared or too stupid to see truth when it bled in front of them. Is this how it ends? She whispered aloud. Her voice was cracked, barely audible. Ellie stirred weakly, letting out a low moan. Her skin was like fire. Clara wet a corner of the blanket with spit, the only moisture she had left, and wiped her daughter's forehead. No, Clara said. Her voice was firmer now, if only just. You're not dying here. She tried to stand again. Her knees gave. She fell forward onto her hands, gasping, still. She didn't stop. Clara crawled on her hands and knees, dragging herself to the edge of the rise in the land. She looked out, hoping for a creek, a road, a sign, anything. There was nothing. Just moonlight on rock and sand and open hell. She collapsed beside Ellie again. This time she didn't cry. There were no more tears to give. She wrapped Ellie in the blanket and held her close. Mama's tired, she murmured. Just gonna rest. Just a little. The fire she'd built earlier, just a handful of twigs and dry grass, had already burned out. Its last ember glowed softly, like a heartbeat, and then went dark. But somewhere in the darkness, someone heard a cry, faint, carried on the wind like a ghost's wail. A man on horseback paused on a ridge a mile away. He squinted into the dark. He wasn't sure if he'd imagined it, or if some wild animal had howled. But something pulled at him, some deep instinct he'd long buried under grief and solitude. He turned the horse toward the sound and clicked his tongue. As Clara drifted into unconsciousness. She thought she heard hooves, but that was impossible. No one was coming for them. Not out here. Not in the place. People were left to die. The sound of hooves echoed through the open plains, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Jack McAllister hadn't taken this trail in over 3 years, not since the winter his life fell apart and left him with nothing but an empty house and a worn saddle. He hadn't planned to ride. This way again, but something he couldn't say. What had changed his mind? Jack was a man. People in town didn't ask many questions about. They knew the story. His wife, Lily, had taken sick one December. Their baby boy followed 2 days later. By spring, Jack had sold off most of the herd, boarded up the windows, and disappeared into the hills. Folks said he was a ghost now, more animal than man. He spoke only when necessary, rode into town twice a year, and never stayed long. He preferred silence. He trusted horses more than people, and the only thing he feared anymore was hope. That night, he was heading home with a few bags of supplies, flour, salt, a spool of thread. Nothing urgent. Nothing worth risking travel in the dark for. But when he heard what sounded like a child's cry in the wind, he pulled up his horse and just sat there, listening. It came again, faint, barely audible over the wind. Jack scanned the landscape. There were no camps nearby, no towns, and the wagon trail had long since turned west. Anyone out here now wasn't just lost, they were in trouble. He clicked his tongue, and the horse obeyed, turning toward the sound. It didn't take long before he saw them. A woman, a child, both barely alive. The mother lay curled around the little girl like a broken wing. Dust clung to them. The blanket was torn. The fire was dead. And the stillness, the awful stillness, cut straight through Jack's chest. He dismounted without a word, knees creaking as he knelt beside the child. Her cheeks were burning with fever. Her lips cracked and dry. She stirred just barely. As he reached out to check her pulse, she was alive. Weak, but alive. Then the mother moved barely. Her eyes fluttered open, and for one breathless moment, Jack saw a mixture of fear and hope in them that made his stomach twist. "Don't take her," she whispered, voice ragged. "I ain't talking to anyone," Jack said quietly, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now." She tried to lift her head, but couldn't. She collapsed against the ground again, her body given out. Jack looked from the woman to the child, and something old and painful stirred in his chest. Grief had hollowed him out, made him a shell of the man he used to be. But now, staring at these two, it was as if some long-dead part of him had taken its first breath in years. He took off his coat and wrapped it around the child, then hoisted her gently into one arm. He paused, then carefully lifted the mother too, cradling her against his chest like a man carrying something sacred. He whispered to the girl, "Don't cry, sweetheart. Nobody's dying today. Not if I can help it." They rode through the night, Jack's horse sure-footed and strong. The weight of the woman and her child didn't slow him down. If anything, it made him more focused, more alive than he'd felt in years. By dawn, the peaks of Timber Hollow came into view. Jack's ranch, tucked between two ridges, hidden by pine and rock. No one had been up there in a long time. No one but him. But now he had company. And somewhere deep in his soul, he didn't mind the idea. He laid them both gently on the bed inside the small cabin. The fire was stoked. Water boiled. He crushed willow bark for fever and pressed damp claws to the child's forehead. He made broth and whispered soft reassurances, though he wasn't sure if either of them could hear. For 2 days they drifted in and out of consciousness. Jack didn't leave their side. He barely ate, barely slept. By the third day, the little girl opened her eyes and said, "Are you the cowboy that found us?" Jack smiled faintly. "Reckon I am. What's your name?" she asked. "Jack. I'm Ellie. That's my mama." Jack glanced at the woman, still resting. "I know." Ellie looked around. "Is this your house?" "It is now," Jack said, voice almost a whisper. "And for as long as you need it." He didn't know who they were. He didn't know what they'd run from, or what hell they'd been through. But he knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't going to let them go back to it, not while he was still breathing. Jack McCullister's ranch sat nestled in a quiet mountain hollow, sheltered by tall pines and granite ridges that had stood for thousands of years. Timber Hollow was hard to find unless you knew where to look forgotten by maps, and intentionally so. Jack had chosen this place for its silence. For 3 long years, it had been his refuge and his prison. Now, it was something else entirely. It was a sanctuary. Clara. Whitmore awoke in a room that didn't belong to Payne. The bed was warm. The air smelled like cedar and wood smoke. A fire crackled softly nearby. She blinked slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind fogged with memories, dust, heat, Ellie's fevered cries. And then a voice. A man's voice. She sat up too fast and winced. Her limbs ached. Her hands were bandaged. Panic sparked in her chest. "Ellie?" She rasped, her voice barely a whisper, from across the room. A gentle voice answered. "She's safe, sleeping." Clara turned her head toward the figure standing in the doorway, a tall man with a weathered face, worn boots, and eyes that held more sorrow than danger. "Where are we?" "Timber Hollow," he said. "My ranch. Found you two out on the trail 3 nights ago." Clara tried to swing her legs off the bed, but Jack raised a calming hand. "You're safe," he said gently. "You don't have to run anymore." She stared at him, unsure whether to trust those words. She had heard safe before from men who turned on her the moment she looked away, but Ellie's soft breathing behind her, warm and steady under wool blankets, told a different story. Clara lay back down and closed her eyes. Over the next few days, healing began not just in body, but in soul. Jack gave them space. He didn't ask questions. He cooked simple meals, beans, cornbread, stew. He showed Ellie how to feed the chickens and let her name the old mule Butterbean. He taught her how to whistle through a blade of grass, and she taught him how to play cat's cradle with a piece of string. Clara watched it all quietly. At first, she didn't say much. She kept her distance. Years of hurt had taught her to expect the worst, even from kindness. But Jack's actions never wavered. He kept his word, his hands to himself, and his presence calm. And gradually, Clara began to soften. She helped him mend a broken fence line. She chopped vegetables while he stirred the stew. She laughed, just once, when he accidentally sat on a pine cone and let out a yelp like a kicked dog. He looked startled by the sound, as if he hadn't heard laughter in so long he forgot what it was. Neither of them talked much about the past, until one night, when the wind howled through the trees like it remembered every sorrow the world had ever known. Clara finally spoke. "He would have killed me," she said. Staring into the fire, Jack didn't ask who he was. He said if I ever left, he'd come after me. "Take Ellie," said she belonged to him. "Like property." Her voice shook, but her jaw stayed firm. "I thought if I got far enough, if I disappeared, I could make her life different than mine." Jack nodded slowly, staring into the same fire. "I know what it's like," he said after a long silence. "To lose everything." Clara looked at him, and for the first time saw something beyond the quiet strength, an old wound. "Still bleeding. My wife," he said, voice low. "And our boy." "Winter sickness. Nothing I could do." Clara's eyes filled. Not with pity, but with recognition. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared, like two people sitting at the edge of the same cliff, knowing the drop, but choosing for once not to fall. The next morning, Clara found Ellie sitting in Jack's lap on the porch, listening to him tell a story about a grumpy raccoon that stole his boots once. Ellie giggled. Jack's voice was warm, and for a moment, Clara saw a glimpse of something impossible, a future, not just survival, not just escape, but life. Real life. That evening, Jack brought Clara a small pouch. Inside were a few coins, a compass, and a folded map. "If you want to keep going," he said, "I'll take you to the next safe town myself." Clara looked at the items, then at him. "And if we don't?" Jack's voice was quiet. "Then you're welcome to stay." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't take the pouch either. Timber Hollow, once a place of retreat, was now a place of quiet rebirth. The lonely rancher. The broken mother. The little girl who laughed like she hadn't been chased by monsters. None of them had planned to find each other. But sometimes, the places we run to are the very places we were meant to be. Peace in the wilderness doesn't last forever. For Clara and Ellie, Timber Hollow had become more than shelter, it had become hope. A soft, steady kind of hope, the kind that crept in quietly, like sunlight warming a cabin floor. Jack McAllister's ranch had given them space to breathe, to rest, to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them, but the past always leaves a trail. Some men are made of nothing but the hunger to follow it. It began with a sound a distant echo of hooves were there. Shouldn't have been any. Jack heard it first. Chopping wood just beyond the barn. He paused, axe in middle, his eyes narrowing toward the tree line. The sound faded as quickly as it came, but he knew better than to ignore a gut feeling. He finished his task, slower now, and sharpened his knife that night with a little more care than usual. 2 days later, Clara found the fence line cut near the eastern ridge. Not a clean break, sabotage, deliberate. Jack patched it without comment, but when Ellie went to sleep that night, he took down the rifle from above the mantel and laid it across his lap by the fire. "Someone's out there," he said. Clara stiffened. "Could be nothing," he added. "Could be they just stumbled through." Clara didn't respond. She just wrapped her arms tighter around herself. The truth was, she'd known this peace couldn't last. Her husband, Burke Lantry, was the kind of man who didn't let go of what he claimed. And he'd always claimed her. She hadn't just fled a marriage, she'd escaped property, at least in his mind. And more than that, she'd taken Ellie. That alone was enough to drive him west, dragging his influence behind him like a noose. Clara told Jack everything that night. The forced wedding. The threats. The hired men. The power Burke held with local lawmen and merchants back east. "He won't stop," she said. "He doesn't want me back. He just doesn't want me to be free." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd seen men like that before. Men who couldn't live with the idea of losing control. "They'll come through the low trail," he said finally. "If they're tracking you, that's the only way in." At dawn, Jack rode into the nearest outpost, a half-day's ride, and spoke with the county sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Hank Rowe. Rowe had a reputation for being fair but cautious. Jack told him enough to raise concern. He didn't mention names yet, just enough to plant the seed. "I've got a woman and child up at Timber Hollow," Jack said. "If anyone starts asking about runaways or property, you let me know." Rowe nodded. "You expecting trouble?" Jack stared toward the horizon. "No," he said. "I know it's coming." The attack came 3 nights later. It started with smoke. Someone tried to set fire to the stable. Then came the shouting, gunshots cracking like thunder in the dark. Jack pushed Clara and Ellie into the root cellar, telling Clara to keep the door barred no matter what. There were 3 of them. Hired guns. Rough men, not from any town Jack knew. He took cover behind the porch, rifle ready. When one man crept toward the cabin, Jack dropped him with a single shot. Another flanked the barn. Jack moved quickly, catching him at the flank, knocking him out cold. But the third, he came through the trees, quietly. Slipping past Jack and heading straight for the cellar. Clara heard the footsteps above. She pulled Ellie behind her and stood in the dim light of the lantern, her hands shaking but ready. When the cellar door creaked open, She fired. The pistol Jack had left her recoiled hard. But the shot hit true. The man fell backward with a grunt, blood soaking the front of his coat. Clara stood over him, breathing hard, her arms shaking. She didn't recognize him, not her husband. Just another paid dog sent to do a coward's work. Jack arrived seconds later. He stared at the man, then at Clara. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. "I told you," she said, voice flat. "He won't stop." By morning, the sheriff had arrived, called in by Jack's earlier warning. Jack and Clara explained everything: names, dates, the threats. The trail that led from Missouri to Wyoming. Sheriff Rowe listened, then nodded grimly. "Sounds like your husband stepped out of line," he said. "West of the Mississippi, we don't look too kindly on men who treat women like cattle." Rowe promised to send word up the chain to file charges, investigate Lantry's men, and get protection in place. "Until then," he said, tipping his hat, "keep that rifle close." As the sheriff rode off, Jack stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over Timber Hollow. Behind him, Clara wrapped a blanket around Ellie, holding her close. "You still want us here?" she asked softly. Jack didn't answer right away. He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers without hesitation. "You're not just here, Clara," he said. "You belong." The past had found them. But so had strength. And Clara Whitmore was done running. Now she was ready to fight for her future. The morning after the attack, the land was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet. This was not the hollow stillness of grief or fear. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm. A silence made of survival. Timber Hollow had been scarred. Burn marks blackened one corner of the stable. A few fence posts lay in ruin, but it still stood. So did Clara. So did Ellie. And so did Jack. Sheriff Rowe kept his word. Within a week, formal charges had been filed against Burke Lantry back in Missouri. Witness statements from the outpost confirmed Clara's story, and the surviving gunman now in custody had admitted to being paid to retrieve a runaway wife and her brat. The law was finally on Clara's side. She didn't celebrate. Not exactly. But she breathed deeper. She smiled more. And when she watched Ellie sleeping, she no longer did it with fear clenching her chest. There was still healing to be done, but now there was time to do it. Over the next few weeks, life at Timber Hollow found a rhythm. Jack taught Clara how to ride properly, how to control a horse at a gallop, how to shoot from the saddle. "Just in case," he said, though his tone was more proud than cautious. Clara took to it quickly. She was stronger than she had ever realized, and finally had the space to discover it. Ellie began calling Jack Mr. Cowboy, and followed him like a loyal pup from barn to field. She asked 100 questions a day. How do chickens lay eggs? Why do horses sleep standing up? Can you make beans taste like candy? Jack, who had once spent entire days in silence, now found himself chuckling more often than not. He even built her a swing from an old rope and a plank of pine. She called it the flying tree. Clara watched all of this with cautious joy. Every day that passed without fear felt like a small miracle. And yet, in quiet moments, she found herself asking the same question: what now? One evening, after supper, as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the mountains, Jack brought out a small, dust-covered box. Inside was a ring. Simple, gold, worn with time. It was Lily's, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She'd want someone to wear it who still believes in something. Clara stared at it, stunned. "Jack." "I'm not a skin today," he said quickly, eyes steady. "I'm not even a skin tomorrow. But I need you to know you've got a place here. You and Ellie, not out of pity, not out of debt, but because I want you here." He paused, searching her face. "I've lived with ghosts for a long time. Clara, you and that little girl, you chased 'em off." Clara felt tears rising. But they weren't the kind that came from pain. They were the kind that came from the sudden, overwhelming realization that she was free, free to choose, free to stay, free to love again. She reached out, closing his hand around the ring. "I believe in something," she whispered. Weeks turned to months. Seasons changed. Clara never did leave Timber Hollow. By the time spring arrived, she had a small garden planted beside the cabin. Ellie had a schoolbook Jack had found on one of his trips to town. And the townsfolk who once whispered about the ghost rancher and the strange woman and child? They now waved and smiled when they passed Clara at the general store. One day, Ellie tugged on Jack's sleeve while he was fixing the barn roof. "Are you my papa now?" she asked plainly. Jack looked down at her, then over at Clara, who was standing nearby, basket in hand, listening. He climbed down from the ladder, crouched in front of the girl, and said, "Only if you want me to be." Ellie grinned. "I do. Then I reckon that settles it." The last traces of Clara's old life faded like dust in the wind. The name Burke Lantry became just another shadow left behind on the trail. And Timber Hollow? It became something more than land or home. It became theirs. A place built not on blood or power or fear, but on healing, on choice, and on love. Final line. Sometimes you don't ride out looking for salvation, Jack said one evening as Ellie fell asleep in Clara's lap. Sometimes salvation finds you crying in the wind,